Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, this is the second session of the ninth topic titled Vikings, Mongols, and Aztecs, Nomadic Invasions and Climate Change, and the Remaking of World Civilizations. Now, in this second session, we're going to now turn our attention to Asia and look at another nomadic group that is going to be affected by climate change. And they're going to become very active in forming alliances, building a large war machine, and then turn that war machine against sedentary societies and established civilizations, such as China, for example. We're going to look at that. And the group that we're talking about here are the Mongols. And as we'll see, they're not just going to invade and occupy China, but they're going to be moving across Eurasia, invading the Muslim world, the northern parts of the Indian subcontinent, and they're going to go as far as invading Eastern Europe as well. Okay, so let us turn our attention to our outline here. And this is, once again, another nomadic group, just like the Vikings that we saw on part one, that was affected by climate change. And because of the extreme weather conditions that they endured, the nomadic groups that were very, of course, comfortable and accustomed to survive in their own habitat and environment experienced significant difficulties doing so as a result of those changes, and then they're going to now march against civilizations. Now, let's look first and foremost at the physical geography from which the Mongols came from, the steppes, as they're called. The steppes is really a very large geographical area that encompasses the northern region of Eurasia, in this case. And it is very important to look at the geography of this region in order to understand how the Mongols adapted to that environment, but yet with climate change, of course, they experienced significant challenges and difficulties continuing surviving in that environment. Okay, so the steppes, again, this is the region in question. Again, it encompasses a vast, of course, territory that involves the northern part of Asia, as you can see here. So the Mongols actually came from the eastern portion of the steppes. They were one of the many nomadic groups that inhabited this region. And the steppes included all of this region all the way to Eastern Europe, parts of Eastern Europe, Eastern Russia. Again, all of this constituted the steppes, and it was really a region that was inhabited primarily by nomadic groups, not necessarily sedentary or agriculturalist, like the ones that actually inhabited the river systems, that we discussed in the past. So the climate tends to be very cold in the steppes, at least in the eastern section, because this is the region from which the Mongols came from. We see dry, grassy plains. There are, of course, a system of mountains as well, mountainous regions. There are significant portions of the steppes that are covered with mountains. And as I indicated in a previous topic, concerning China, for example, those mountains, at least for a while, served as a buffer uh, protecting China from nomadic invasions for thousands of years, the mountains of the steppes. But as we'll see, the conditions as we approach, let us just say, the 800s of the contemporary era had dramatically changed in the steppes and in the western frontier of China as a result of an explosion of population of nomadic groups. And we have, of course, new technologies. We have, not only the horse technology that had been acquired and mastered by the nomadic groups of the region, but also bows and arrows and other weapons, gunpowder. We're going to be talking about that, of course, in just a few moments. So the technologies, the military technologies had evolved. So despite the fact that the mountainous regions had served as a buffer zone, by this time, China was totally overwhelmed and overrun by nomadic groups. The eastern steppe also is known for producing very little rainfall, about 20 inches of rain per year. We also have limited rivers at the same time. So this is not really an area suitable for agriculture. Like, for example, the Yangtze River, the Yellow River of China, that was more suitable for that. Once we move upward, into that region, the peoples there are not going to be growing crops and forming settlements and, urban centers, etc. The fauna of the steppes was composed largely of horses, which the nomads domesticated and mastered, sheep and goats. Okay, so those will be the primary animals that the nomads relied on for transportation, but also for sustenance, for clothing, for housing, etc. Okay. All right. So, in general terms, the steppes have been for thousands of years populated by nomadic groups, and they have also forged a culture of their own. It's not agricultural society, of course, but they will form a culture of their own. They're pastoralists, meaning that they herd animals. Once again, horses, sheep, goats, they move around constantly, so they're migratory. So we don't find towns or cities in the steppes. Okay, people are moving from place to place all the time. And what they're doing is that they're simply moving into new areas for pasturage to feed their animals. So this is why they're migrating constantly, based on the seasons as well. Now, compared to the agriculturalist societies, for example, like China and the other civilizations, they are considered to be poor. Okay, so they do not store treasures per se, although they in many cases raid civilizations for treasure, but in many cases that treasure was used to be traded for other products, whether it's leather work or food products, etc. Okay? So they're considered to be poor. Now, they are excellent horseback riders and archers. Since very early age, children are taught how to ride horses. I mean, there was a saying back during that day that, the Mongols were born on top of a horse, for example, because, again, this is something that was central to their way of life, to their lifestyle, and to their entire culture. So mastery of the horse not only for transportation purposes, but also for warfare, was essential. Okay, it was perhaps one of the primary modes of subsistence for the Mongols and for the other um, nomadic groups of that region. They did have some iron tools and steel weapon technology. They worked with iron, okay, and they forged weapons from that. Um, and much later, as we'll see, they also developed quite sophisticated technologies. For example, the cannon, for example. Uh, this is going to be something that the Mongols also crafted and they got a hold of and enabled them um, to conquer the different civilizations that they subdued. Okay. Now, for the most part, uh, the nomadic groups of the steppes shifted between raiding civilizations and trading with them. During times of plentiful, they will trade with civilizations. You know, when they were not really cornered, in other words, by the environment, that they had plenty of food and so on, they will often trade some of their animals for some grain and other products. When situations got difficult, when there was a scarcity of resources and the like, they will raid the civilizations, okay, to steal food or treasure, okay. And this has been pretty much the kind of relationship that had existed for thousands of years. The nomads carried out those two activities simultaneously depending on their situation. Okay. Now, the nomadic groups of the steppes, particularly on the eastern side of the steppes, were we've been talking about the Turkic groups. When we discuss China, they have interacted significantly with Chinese civilization, going back all the way to the Zhou dynasty, for example. The Uyghurs as well is another distinct nomadic group. The Huns of the Central Steppe, Central Asia, and also the Mongols. Okay, those are the four main groups that had inhabited this region and had or will play in our discussion a key role in reshaping civilizations. And we're not just going to focus on China. We're going to also focus on the other civilizations that they invaded as well. In terms of China, China did consider the nomads problematic, despite the fact that they had this very ambivalent relationship with them. It got to a point that just before the contemporary era, during the Shi dynasty, Emperor Shi Huangdi, for example, deemed necessary to start building a wall to protect China from the northern, where they were called barbarians, okay, the nomadic groups. And so we see the construction of the Great Wall got started around 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, during the reign of Shi Huangdi. This is a project that was continued by subsequent dynasties like the Han dynasty. We talked about that in our discussion of China. And after the Han, even the Tang dynasty continued with this project. And of course, even after the Tang, for many centuries afterwards, subsequent emperors from other dynasties continued to expand upon the Great Wall. So there has been, at least in China, a great attempt to keep those nomadic groups at bay and to keep them out again out of China. Now, just before the rise of the Mongols, the nomads had begun to organize themselves politically and build their own empires. So, before the rise of the Mongol Empire, we saw, for example, in 1552, the formation of the Turkic Empire. Okay? It was a short-lived empire, but an empire nonetheless. Okay? And so this was considered to be a neighbor of China just to the west, and we see already the nomads becoming more and more active, and they're forming their own alliances, and they're forming their own imperial systems. This is, again, the stretch of the Turkic Empire, as you can see, in the steppes. Again, so it is really this region that we just discussed that is going to be significant for the formation of nomadic empires. After the Turkic, we see the rise of the Uyghur Empire. In 744, we see this other empire on the rise. It's nomadic, just north of China, in the steppes. Once again, we see the formation of yet another manifestation of this nomadic empire. And it is really at this point that we see the beginning of climate change taking place, around 850, just towards the end of this empire. The steppes are going to be greatly affected by the climate. Okay, remember, that receives very little rainfall across the year. It does provide pasturage for the animals, but as the climate is beginning to cool down, as we'll see, that pasturage is going to decline significantly. And this is going to push the nomads out of the steppes into the south and raiding and raining upon the sedentary societies that had more resources, more food, and more greenlands, if you will, to feed their animals as well. Okay, so keep that in mind, that as we see this second nomadic empire coming to a close, just about that time, the climate is about to shift. And this is going to lead to the rise of the Mongols. So let's look at the rise of the Mongols and trying to understand some of the reasons why we're going to look at yet another nomadic group forming their own empire. And now this empire, the Mongol Empire, will be far more successful in organizing itself militarily and pretty much overrunning all of the civilizations of the Near and Far East. And they're going to come close at also overrunning Europe as well. They weren't successful at the end, but they were quite close. Okay, so this is the region where the Mongols are coming from. This is the region of northern Asia. And once again, the climate around 850 is beginning to cool down. And it affected this region in a very significant way. The Mongols had adapted in this region for millennia. They had domesticated the horse, they herd sheep and goats and so on. And the wildlife in this region began to decline significantly. And so this is one of the reasons why the Mongols are going to become very, very active, very hostile. They're on the move, and they are on this process of expansionism. And that is because of this climatic pressure. Now, before we get to the raids and the invasions and so on of the Mongols and the creation of their empire, let's take a quick look at their culture. Just the way we also look at, for example, Viking culture as well. It's important to gain some insights about what kind of livelihood, customs, what kind of practices and ideas they carried out. Once again, their main mode of subsistence was from herding animals, goats and sheep, particularly goats and sheep. This is from which they obtain most of the items of their diet, milk and meat, for example. Those animals also provided the hides for clothing and housing as well. And the Mongols also moved constantly. They were migratory, moving from place to place, and they also carried out training activities. So they moved in caravans. Okay, they traveled together. Entire families travel together in caravans, and they use hot wagons in order to carry some of their merchandise, for example, that they traded or that they gained from raids and so on. This is, again, very typical of Mongol culture. Once again, they were expert horsemen. Perhaps in the world at that time, they were the most skilled horsemen in the world by far. Once again, since very, very early age, 4-year-olds will be now put on horseback again, to lose their fear and to start really becoming more and more accustomed to be riding a horse, for example. They played different kinds of sports, like a polo sport on top of horses as well. It was kind of a typical entertainment. And they were also trained to fight on horse as well, on horseback, more so than on foot. They will fight, of course, in any format, but this is something that the men got training since very, very early age. Okay, they were excellent archers, for example, and warriors fighting on horseback and so on. So they dominated this technology like no other culture around the world. Okay, those are, of course, just paintings that depict, the Mongols, Mongol archers, for example, being very, very much on target while riding a horse and a moving, horse. They still had incredible accuracy hitting their targets. Okay. Now, in terms of the religion, Mongol religion had not gotten past beyond the level of or the stage of animism. Animism, if you recall, it is a worldview, it's a religious worldview in which people conceive the world as a world of spirits. Okay? That the world is populated, inhabited, and animated by spirits. Okay? So there's an absence of gods. The Mongols did not really have major gods, so they were not polytheistic. Okay? This is not a polytheistic religion in which there were major gods of creation handling the different functions of the universe, but rather it was just nature being populated, animated by spirits. The spirits of the land, the spirits of the sea, the spirits of the wind, for example, the spirits of fire, and so on. Again, it is really just an animistic religion. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why the Mongols, after they stepped out of their area of Mongolia or Northern Asia, once they encountered all the other advanced civilizations and they encountered very sophisticated religions, why they became very fascinated about them. To the point that they converted, in many cases, to the other religions. For example, Islam. They believed that Islam was a very highly sophisticated religion. It was monotheistic. They have never encountered, again, belief systems so complex, such as, for example, the monotheistic religions of Islam and the others. The Orthodox Christianity, for example, and so on. Of the Russians or the Byzantine Empire, for example. So they were very fascinated by the other religions. And one of the reasons is because they were still, up to this point, in this animistic stage of development. And that they only believed in spirits, in other words. Now, since they don't have an organized religion and major gods to pray to, they don't have temples, they don't have churches, they're not going to have an organized priesthood. However, they do have spiritual guides and spiritual leaders, and those are the shamans or shamans. So shamanism ran strong among the Mongols. And those were not really, once again, official titles given to individuals. Those were actually just individuals that came from the people. They will rise up from moment to moment, depending on the occasion. Whenever there was a particular ritual that needed to be performed for the spirits of the land and so on, well, there will be a volunteer, somebody that will perform the ritual and summon the spirits and so on. And after the ritual was over, that person will once again retreat and join the community just like an ordinary member of the tribe. So once again, they had no really special titles or a special place in society. Those were not really permanent occupations either as well. Okay. Now, in terms of their social organization, the Mongols, the basis of Mongol society is kinship, meaning that they are, during this time, living in family units, extended family units. And the family unit that most Mongols formed part of was called the tribe. The word tribal societies is it's just an extended family. And the people that lived in that tribe are related to one another. in familial connections of different kinds. They share common ancestors. So this is the basis, again, of Mongol society. Okay, so those are extended families. There are different tribal groups, but nonetheless, despite that there are different tribal groups, they're all connected through a system of common ancestors. Okay, this is very similar to how China is organized as well. We talked about that. Kinship, the clan, for example, the different geographical clans of China, and so on. This has been pretty much for thousands of years the basis of Chinese society. Again, that China is really a gigantic family, an extended family. And this is no different. The leader of the tribe, the patriarch, is the person that has a direct line of descent going back to the founding ancestors. Okay. Now, this is a warrior society. The purpose of life is to defend the tribe from all kinds of challenges, from the rival groups of the region that are often competing for pasturage lands, for resources, for animals, and so on. So there's increasing competition, of course, between the nomads. And so the Mongols value, therefore, war and warfare. And the most powerful, the most dominant of the tribal groups constitute an aristocracy in and of themselves. They have special privileges. They are the patriarchs, making the most important decisions for the tribe. When the tribe has to move, when the tribe has to wage war. They are indeed the leaders. And that leadership is passed on from father to son. So it's an inherited position. That's what an aristocracy is. From time to time, the Mongols will form alliances. All of the different tribal groups from time to time will come together and form a great federation. And this is often done whenever they confronted danger or a threat, a menace of some sort. So whenever they were confronting danger, they will unify, form a great federation, and fight together, okay, as a block. Now, the leaders were elected by a council of free men, and of course the men were warriors. It was called the Kuriltai. The Kuriltai was a sort of council of free men, the patriarchs, the warriors, and they will elect a leader, and the leader got elected not just because of some tradition or custom going back to certain lineages or certain historical figures of the past, but rather they will elect a person that meet a certain criteria, a true leader, somebody that will exhibit, for example, clear signs of courage, a person who is able to build alliances, who is a very skilled, in other words, diplomat or politician, trying to bring the different tribes together and build these large alliances, and person that will have the capacity to unify all of the nomadic groups together under his leadership. Those were the kinds of qualities that the Mongols were looking after in order to choose who the leader was going to be. Now, having said that, this is how and why we're going to see the rise of a leader, a Mongol leader that is going to unify not only the Mongol tribal groups, but all of the nomadic groups of the steppes into this great, great federation and build a very, very powerful war machine. And that person became known as Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, again in 1206, is going to become the leader of the Mongols and rise up to the occasion and build this very large war machine. His name was not Genghis Khan. He was an individual who was born under the name of Temujin. Okay, Temujin. That was his original name before he was actually labeled Genghis Khan, which means the great Khan or the great leader. And he shared, let me just go back a little bit. He shared some common characteristics with Alexander the Great, in that his military career started out as a teen, just like Alexander the Great. And as we'll see, just like Alexander the Great, he also inherited the army from his father. Okay, so those are the kind of parallels or common characteristics that both men shared in common. Okay, now Temujin, when he was a teen, he was abducted by one of his father's enemies and rivals. He was actually taken away. He was kidnapped and he was taken away to a mountain. And he was kept there for several months. Now, he managed to escape his captivity and he returned to his camp. Although when he came back to his camp, he also found out that his camp had been also attacked by another rival. And many of his horses were stolen, and some of the women that he had as well were also stolen as well. So his camp got raided, in other words. Now, he pledged revenge, and little by little, he attacked and was able to subdue his rivals and avenge them all. And it is precisely that, those kinds of feats, that stunned all his peers and all the tribal groups around them. And more, he started attracting a large following, his bravery. He was still a teen, but he was just showing signs of a great leader in this case. Okay? So it is at this point, because he's now attracting a large following, there's no doubt that he's a very courageous, individual and so on. He's overcoming obstacles, avenging the kidnapping and the attacking of his camp and so on, that the Kuriltai, this council of warriors and free men, elected him as supreme leader. And it is at that point that he inherited his father's army as well. So now he has under his command a new kind of force, a new war machine. And he was a very skilled general as well. He divided this war machine into fighting units known as the tumens. It was a division between heavy and light cavalry. Okay, so he was a very, very shrewd strategist, let I just say. And he really began to plan an invasion of China to start with by dividing this war machine in this way. Now, this heavy and light cavalry, the way he did it was to divide it into different units, as I said. The largest unit was composed of 10,000 cavalry. Okay, now this very large unit of 10,000 cavalry was also subdivided into units of 10,000. I'm sorry, 1,000. And every of those units was further subdivided into units of 100. And those 100 units was also subdivided into units of 10. This is the way that he is planning, if you will, the strategy to overrun China to start with. Okay, he's also including flaming and exploding arrows. His war machine also included the use of gunpowder projectiles as well. So it is indeed, at this point in time in history, the most sophisticated war machine up to date. Okay, and it's about to be marching across Eurasia. And as we'll see, is going to really build the largest land-based empire that the world has ever seen. Okay? Now, before he decides to invade China, he was a very skilled, once again, leader. He was able to unify all the nomadic groups of Central Asia. So this is not just Mongols. He's unifying all of the nomadic groups of the steppes. Okay? All of them are unified under his leadership. So this is the rise of the nomads. Okay? This is the rise of the nomads. They're all coalescing now and building a very fearsome military war machine that is going to be bent on expansion. Okay? Total expansion. And part of this has to do, once again, with climate change, of course. Now, the Mongols will be invading civilizations, and one of the first civilizations that they invaded was China. Now, let us just have a quick background as to what was happening in China that led the Mongols to invade it. So, quick background. Okay, so if you recall, after the Tang Dynasty, we see another dynasty coming into power in China, the Song Dynasty, around 960 AD. And this is a dynasty that is going to collapse in 1279, and they're going to collapse as a result of the Mongols, as we'll see. Now, the Song's dynasty is really moving away from the policies of the Tang dynasty that came before them. Remember, the Tang dynasty was very open to welcome the nomads, and there was a lot of cultural exchange in China. We see a lot of Turkic cultural elements moving into China. And China, to a certain degree, was kind of forgetting about these classical roots to a certain degree. It was going nomad, in other words, during the Tang period. Now, the Song dynasty, one of the reasons why they antagonized the Mongols and led the Mongols to invade China was because they tried to reverse that policy. And they wanted to rebirth the classical ideas, the classical philosophies, the classical traditions of ancient China. They were trying to reject as much as possible all of the nomadic cultures, trying to cleanse China from the nomadic influences. So there is a certain rejection of the nomadic presence in China. And so this is creating a certain hostile environment and antagonism, if you will, against the nomads. This is from the Chinese perspective. Now, Genghis Khan comes around in 1206, and now with this new military machine, he is now invading China from the north. And most of North China falls to the Mongols in 1215. Beijing, for example, falls to the Mongols in 1215. And so what we see is that China is now on a retreat. Remember that there was a certain expansionist process that took place during the Han Dynasty. It was a military expansion, the conquest of new lands, and we see this massive acquisition of territories to the west, by the Hans, the Han Dynasty. Well, now that the nomads had coalesced under the leadership of the Khan, all of those territories are lost by China, and now China is on a retreat and is now concentrating on the southern core, where it started initially, where China started in the two rivers, and the Yangtze and the Yellow River, for example. So it's contracting. So the Song Dynasty goes south, and it loses the northern fringes of the Chinese Empire to the Mongols. So this is not yet the full conquest of China. This is just China is now contracting, is losing its northern provinces and the western provinces as well. Okay? So this is the first phase, if you will, of China's conquest by the Mongols. Then, after the fall of northern China, the Mongols are going to turn their attention to the west. They will be invading Eastern Europe, mainly Russia, but also the Middle East, the Islamic world, from, let us just say, 1219 to 1240 AD. Now, Genghis Khan in 1217 dies, and his son, Ogedei, succeeds the Khan as leader. And Ogedei and his brothers are going to embark on a series of conquests in which they're going to be decimating, of course, populations and toppling empires, in the Middle East, but also in Eastern Europe as well. For example, the Mongols invade Russia. There is one of the brothers of Ogedei that forms a coalition of forces known as the Golden Horde. And they launch invasions, the so-called winter invasions, against Russia. Now, why they're attacking during the winter? It was because during the summertime, the terrain in Russia was just very, very wet, very muddy, and it was very difficult to maneuver. The soil was just very, very thick, that forces would just stall on that muddy terrain. So it is during the winter time that we see that terrain being covered with snow, and it facilitates, of course, the movement of horses and troops across this region. Now, it was very devastating. The Mongols, when they invaded Russia, they spared no one. Cities were razed to the ground. Populations were either slaughtered or captured for enslavement. And this was, again, a total nightmare, again, for the peoples of Russia. And remember, this is just a kingdom that got started by the Vikings when they formed, for example, the kingdom of Kiev. We talked about that when we talked about, the Vikings in session 1. So this was a newly formed kingdom, and that by the 1200s was totally decimated. Kiev, for example, the kingdom of Kiev fell to the Mongols and it was leveled to the ground. Again, it was just catastrophic, for the people that actually lived during those times. The Mongols will just be a force that will just destroy everything in their wake. Okay, the transformations that the Mongols brought to Russia, in this case, was that it brought 2.5 centuries of Mongol bondage. Okay, so for 2.5 centuries, Russia was now under the command, under the rule of the Mongols. Okay, even the Russian lords, the landlords, the aristocracy, became vassals to the Mongols. They were subservient. They were subjects of the Mongols, paying tribute to them. The other unfortunate consequence of this is that the Russian farmers, peasants, were enserfed. They were not enserfed before this time. They were free. They were just, people that were working the land, growing crops. But with the arrival of the Mongols, the peasants needed protection. So what they did is that they offered their labor as a form of payment for protection. So they went to the Russian lords and told the lords, look, we need you to protect us. We're willing to be your serfs if you protect us, if you protect us from the Mongols, in other words. So free farmers or peasants are now becoming enserfed. And, a serf in Russia, it was identical to being a slave, in other words. So this really turned the peasant population into slaves, in other words. And now, no, not necessarily to the Mongols, but slaves to the Russian lords. And this is a situation that persisted in Russia for many, many centuries, all the way to the 19th century. Again, in the 19th century, the Russian serfs were liberated. So for many, many centuries, Russia had a very large population of serfs. Over 70% of the Russian people were serfs, all the way to the mid-19th century. All right. Now, the Mongols also turned their attention to the Islamic world. They move into the Islamic world. First, they move into the Holy Land, and they defeat the group of nomadic groups that had entered the region centuries before them, the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks, as they were known, that arrived to this region. They arrived from Central Asia. They converted to Islam, and they took over the Holy Land. The Mongols conquered the Seljuk Turks in 1253, and they took over the Holy Land as well. In 1253, this sent shockwaves across the Muslim world. Again, that there's a new group of nomads that had just arrived, a second wave, if you will, of nomads, had taken over the Holy Land. The Mongols turned their attention to the largest empire of the Middle East, the Persian Empire. It was actually the Abbasid Caliphate. In this case, we talked about that in the previous topic. It's an Islamic empire at this time in the 1200s. Now, the Mongols are trying to subdue the Persian Empire and turn it into a kind of like a client state of sorts, meaning that what they want is for the Persian Empire to recognize Mongol rule, Mongol supremacy, and pay tribute to the Mongols, in other words. Okay? So the Mongols initially don't really care if the Abbasid dynasty continues ruling the Persian Empire. They just want to be recognized as overlords and to be paid tribute. And when the Persians, the Abbasids, full of hubris, reject the proposal and dismiss the Mongols as barbarians, as uncivilized, and so on, as heathens and pagans, the Mongols are going to turn their wrath and their rage against the Abbasids and the Persians, and they're going to destroy their capital. The capital of the Persian Empire of the Abbasid Caliphate was Baghdad in 1258. And they're going to, once again, raze it to the ground. In 40 days, the Mongols entered the city and destroyed everything in it. And it was one of the marvels of the Islamic world. There was no denying about that. Again, it was one of the marvels in the world. The city of Baghdad, it was just, again, a magnificent city full of temples and palaces. You know, it was a very vibrant commercial empire full of wealth and so on, foreign and exotic goods, and public libraries full of knowledge, and astronomers, etc. Again, it was indeed a very dynamic city, to say the least. And everything was destroyed. And every single person inside, you know, it was about 800,000 people that lived in the city of Baghdad. Each one of them were killed. Again, those were people of, you know, all ages. You know, everybody died, and the Mongols, you know, killed in 40 days. Again, they killed pretty much everybody. The royal family, the Abbasid Caliphate, was murdered also in a very gruesome manner. They were arrested by the Mongols, and they were rolled in carpets, very exotic carpets, and they were trampled upon by horses. The Mongol cavalry actually trampled upon the all of the members of the Abbasid Caliphate. So they also suffered a very gruesome death as well. Okay, so now the Mongols turned their attention now to the west. They're marching their forces. They want to move into Eastern Europe as well, and perhaps, why not, even Western Europe. But it is precisely as they move into the Eastern Mediterranean that they were confronted by the Egyptian forces of the Mamluks. The Mamluks was a dynasty in Egypt. It was a slave dynasty, by the way. They were also Islamic as well, and they were the ones that put a stop to the Mongol advance in Egypt. And the Mongols got defeated in the year 1260, and with that, of course, Europe got spared. Because if it were not for that, the Mongols would have kept advancing all the way to Byzantium and Greece, perhaps all the way to Western Europe as well. Okay, it was really kind of an unstoppable war machine. So the outcomes of the Mongols' conquest of the Islamic world is that it terrorized the Islamic world. The Islamic world was frightened, by the Mongol invasions, the destruction of Baghdad, for example. We see many people losing faith over Islam as a result of that. This caused a withdrawal of Muslim culture. Muslim culture was expanding. It was, remember, we talked about that, the territorial expansion of the different caliphates and so on. Muslim culture was going through a sort of renaissance, and that kind of put a halt to the Islamic renaissance for a good while. Okay, this is the end of cultural war, the end of cultural growth of Islam. And another consequence of that, or outcome, is that Western Europe was saved from the Mongols as well as a result of their defeat by the Mamluks of Egypt. Okay, now the Mongols are going to take the rest of China. They're going to take over the rest of China from 1235 to 1279. We're going to see the fall of the Song dynasty. And the reasons for that had to do with the Song dynasty becoming more and more inside of China, incompetent for dealing with the foreign invasions. Again, the Mongols that had taken over the northern China, the western frontier was also, again, encroaching upon the western lands as well. And there's also elements of corruption within the Song dynasty. And that actually, those two things, the foreign invasions, unable to deal with them, and the corruption, the Song dynasty lost the mandate of heaven, at least in the perception of the public inside of China. These were just signs that heaven had removed power from that dynasty, and it was now time to give it to another dynasty. And so, as the Song dynasty collapsed, the Mongols arrived, take over, and they installed themselves as rulers of China. And they initiate a new dynasty called the Yuan, or the Mongol dynasty, that ruled China from 1271 to 1368. One of the most renowned rulers of the Yuan dynasty was Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was a great grandson of Genghis Khan. And as ruler of China, he's attempting to rule this new empire. Again, he's now the ruler of China, as the ruler of the Chinese empire. Okay, and this Chinese empire is not just limited to the original Chinese empire prior to the Mongol invasion. Remember that every Mongol conquest is now added to this new Mongol empire that is now headquartered in China. Okay, so this is now again an expanding empire across Eurasia. Now, the Mongols, Kublai Khan, understand that as he's coming into China, he's coming as an outsider. They are indeed nomads. They were considered barbarians, but the Mongols take a lot of pride about, their own culture. I mean, after all, they are indeed conquerors. And they're attempting to preserve Mongol culture. They see themselves as the great conquerors. So they want indeed to create a new social hierarchy, a new social system to separate the Mongol rulers from the rest of Chinese society. Okay, so they introduce a new caste system, again, in which the Mongols are positioned at the very top. Their Muslim allies, due to the fact that they have conquered, of course, the Middle East. Many of the Muslims go to China and they become assistants to the Mongols in the administration of China. And they're brought in as important administrators. And they're second in command. Again, they're second in command in the social hierarchy. North Chinese that tend to have more and more nomadic ancestry are positioned third. And then at the very bottom, we're going to find the ethnic South Chinese at the very bottom, again, of Chinese society. They are indeed a conquered population, again, so they are going to be positioned at the very bottom. Kublai Khan introduces laws to prohibit intermarriage between Mongols and Chinese. And another thing is that the Mongols are trying to create changes inside of China. They see women as nothing other than slaves. Women among the Mongols enjoy significant liberty and freedom. They move around. They participate in the councils in many cases. Their opinion is valued. They're very self-reliant and very independent. But in China society, women are very, very dependent on men. And they don't have a voice in the state. They don't have a voice in the community. And the Mongols are trying to liberate women in China. Liberate them from all those customs and keep them oppressed and so on. So they are trying to indeed create changes inside of Chinese society. So, changes that liberated women for a while, at least while the Mongols were in control of China. But as the Mongols were driven out of China with the fall of the Yuan dynasty, women returned in China back again to their subordinated status. Okay? All right, so in their system of administration, the Mongols realize that they do not have the knowledge, the skills to rule an empire. They had the skills to conquer civilizations and to conquer other empires, but not to govern them. As the old saying went among the Chinese, they said, well, yes, you can conquer a civilization from horseback, but you cannot rule it from there. So what the Mongols realized is that they needed the assistance of the administrators of Chinese society, the civil administrators, the Mandarin class, or the Mandarin caste, the educated gentry, for example, that we talked about, when we talked about China, that were trained under the academies in the schools of Confucianism and so on. They needed those experts. They needed those skills because the Mongols just did not know how to actually go about governing, the empire. So this is a sort of creative response of the Mongols, and that is that they realize that they're bringing in their own very unique skills into the empire, and that is the skills of war. They are expert warriors, horsemen, archers, and the like. They master the art of war, but now they needed to marry that with the skills of the sedentary peoples, the bureaucratic skills of management and administration, tribute collection, irrigation system management, and the like. They needed those skills to be married with their own, and they're creating, of course, a new kind of administration and a new kind of empire. And they're going to derive knowledge from both Chinese, from the Mandarin class, for example, but also from the Persian models of administration. The Confucian scholars, the Mandarins, are providing very valuable assistance about how to run the empire, effectively in terms of the trade, for example, the commerce, tribute collection, water management, hydraulics, engineering, and the like. All of that, again, is being taken care of by the Mandarin class. They're also bringing the Taoist scholars in order to receive information and training about how to live a peaceful life. The Mongols are also interested about philosophy, living a life of inner peace and solitude, etc. They're trying to learn about that as well. They're also deriving knowledge from the Muslim engineers in order to craft new war technologies and also to accelerate the pace of trade as well. So really, the Muslim engineers are going to be critical in formulating new war technologies, the use of gunpowder, for example, the catapult, the cannons, and so on. All of those are going to be crafted, devised by the Muslim engineers. And during this time, there's also the development of a Mongol script as well. The Mongols are in the process during this time of developing their own writing system as well. Okay, so they are indeed acquiring elements of civilization. Okay, they started out as nomads, but they are indeed civilizing to a certain degree as well. During the period of the Mongol Empire, the Mongols actually maintained across the empire a certain sense of peace. This was known as the Pax Mongolica, the peace, the Mongol peace, in other words. This is indeed not just a regular, ordinary empire, but it's a trading empire. The Mongols realized that one way to increase treasure was to expand trade. Okay, the trading activities, commercial exchange, was a faster way to increase revenues and treasure. So they're going to sponsor trade across the empire, and they're going to use the system of roads, like the Silk Roads and other roads that have been built in the past, to offer protection for merchants. Merchants during the Mongol Empire suffered absolutely no damage, no incursions, no theft or of any kind, because the Mongols made arrangements with other nomadic groups to actually protect the roads. Okay, to not bother the merchants, to keep them actually, shifting goods back and forth, because this was enriching the coffers of the Mongols. Okay, now, as a result of the different roads that were kept safe for the merchants, this allowed not only the exchange of commercial goods, but also whenever there's commercial exchange, long distance trade, there's also cultural exchange as well. Okay, so during the Pax Mongolica, we also see a cultural exchange between China and the Muslim world. Again, the Muslim world and China became very interlinked through those systems of roads. Persian astronomers, for example, and medical doctors in China, many of whom were coming from Persia, were increasing knowledge in China of calendars, increasing knowledge of medicine, for example. Chinese learning and technology moves into the Muslim world, and the Muslim world is going to benefit again from the Chinese contributions. Okay, as well. During this time, despite the fact that the Mongols are trying to maintain their separate sense of identity in China, prohibiting, intermarriage and so on, trying to preserve their distinct culture. Despite of all of those efforts, the Mongols indeed, at the very end of the day, end up assimilating to China's culture. Okay, so they are indeed acquiring the culture of China, in the process. As they're trying to rule China, they're indeed, becoming more and more acculturated. This is the Mongol Empire at its height. It was the largest empire in world history, the largest land-based, I should say, empire in world history. It included not only China, most of Asia, Asia Minor, Tibet, Persia, and Iraq. Again, all of that constituted uh, the Mongol Empire, including, of course, Russia as well in Eastern Europe. Okay, so it was a vast imperial system. It did not last very long. It lasted about 100 years, but it was indeed the largest land-based empire in the world, and it came to an end. And the end of the of Mongol rule had to do precisely with the size of this empire. It was just way, way too large. Too large to the point that it needed to be divided into four to be better managed. So again, the division of this empire into four parts, or khanates, as it was called, was a sign that it was very difficult to manage as a single unit, as a single political entity. Okay, so it was actually divided into four, and those were actually the descendants of Genghis Khan that got different portions of the empire, and this really marked kind of like the beginning of the end for the Mongol Empire. Okay, the beginning of the end, the partition, if you will, of this empire into four sections. The second reason why the Mongol rule is going to collapse is when it came to an end, had to do with the Black Death that struck Asia in the 1340s. The Black Death started out in the northern mountains of China. It was actually a flea that carried a certain microbe, that once the fleas will bite, for example, a human being, that microbe infected the human organism and actually killed the human organism in a matter of days. Now, of course, those fleas were carried out by rats, and because now there is international trade taking place, there's long distance trade, and as those rats came into the Chinese towns and cities, they ended up in the wagons of the merchants, and as the merchants are moving cargo from place to place, the Black Death spread far and wide across China. Eventually, it moved into the Muslim world. Eventually, it moved into Europe as well. But it decimated about 30% of Chinese population. 30% of Chinese population died from the Black Death. And the Black Death itself was one of those so-called signs that the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty, was losing the mandate of heaven. People did not see the Mongols as legitimate precisely because of this great dying, again, the Black Death. So this is the second reason why the Mongol rule will come to an end soon thereafter. By 1368, what we see is the fall of the Yuan dynasty, and finally, China is now once again free from the nomads, and we see the end of Mongol rule, but also this is the end of the Mongol Empire as well. It lasted for about a century, about 100 years or so. It was, as I mentioned, the largest land-based empire that the world has ever seen up to date. Did not last more than 100 years, but again, it deserves to be seen as perhaps, again, one of the anomalies, again, in history, that how a group of nomads was able to conquer a series of civilizations and build such a large empire in a very short period of time. All of that, of course, was produced, set off by climate change, the cooling of the planet around 850 that set off, of course, those series of changes. This is the second nomadic group that becomes active, is on the move, and is now raiding civilizations and creating empires and creating significant changes. We already looked at that, the kind of changes it created in Russia, for example, the enslavement of populations, in the Muslim world, the contraction of of Muslim culture, and the fall of China as well. Again, it's very, very significant how China has fallen to the nomads and produced one of the largest empires that the world has ever seen up to this date. Okay, so this is all I have for you. When we come back, we're going to be moving. Finally, our final session of the topic and of the semester is going to look now at the Western Hemisphere. We're going to be looking at the Aztecs. This is another nomadic group that will be moving into central Mexico and also taking over that region and creating a series of changes as well. All of that will be explained and assessed in session 3 when we come back. Thank you.